and welcome back to your #1 source for cozy gaming and design content. I'm Nick, and today we're going to be taking a look at one of my favorite keyboards I've ever owned, the 8Bitdo retro keyboard. Alright, so a bit of background on my love for mechanical keyboards. I personally think mechanical keyboards are some of the more interesting products on the market. Sure, their function is fairly simple, and it's a problem we've had solved for many years now. But from a design standpoint, I think these are an incredibly interesting product that can not only be used for its main function, to serve as an input for your computer, but also as a signifier of your personality, who you are as not only as a person, but as a gamer. Now, I'm not going to come up with some kind of zodiac system for keyboards, and what that means about what kind of gamer you are, because that would be ridiculous. There really isn't any direct line to draw between keyboard preference and game preference. However, given that it is pretty much the #1 physical interface you have with your computer, it's incredibly important, if you want a satisfying and pleasant experience with using your computer, that you have a keyboard that suits your preferences. So, here's a quick and dirty rundown of what kind of options you have as far as keyboards go. Starting from the top, there are essentially two main options: mechanical and membrane. We'll start with what I consider to be the least appealing: membrane. Essentially, what a membrane keyboard consists of is a flat PCB with pads on the surface, which are pressed by a contact that's connected to the underside of a silicone dome. When pressed, this contact sends a signal to your computer that a key has been entered. These are cheap and simple and relatively foolproof. They have far fewer moving parts that can wear out, and because the membrane is one monolithic sheet of silicone, they can be argued to be somewhat waterproof. However, the big caveat for these keyboards is their feel. If this is the only thing that you've ever used, you're not likely to really see an issue. That's probably just what you think a keyboard is. But the second you try a mechanical keyboard, the difference is night and day. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to prefer mechanical keyboards, but the difference is undeniable. That brings us to mechanical keyboards. These include anything that use a physical switch with feedback of some kind to signal the computer that a key has been pressed. Now, there's a plethora of different switch types, ranging from the original buckling spring style to a more modern optical switch. However, the three most common are clicky, tactile, and linear. Now, these don't really refer to the physical mechanism like those first two that I talked about. However, these are really the three most common type of switch, and if you're shopping for a mechanical keyboard, these are going to be what you kind of need to focus on, unless you want to go specialty, which would include those more bespoke, more unique types of mechanical switch. A clicky switch has a very clear and forceful click, caused by these little prongs which snap past two bumps in the actual contact. This gives you a very clear and distinct click, which many people prefer for its immediate and unmistakable feedback. The next style is tactical. Tactical. No, not tactical. Tack switch. The next style is tactile, which is functionally the same as clicky, though the prongs don't stick out as much, so there's less of a click. This is basically a middle ground between clicky and our next style, linear. Linear, in my opinion, is the best feeling. It doesn't have those same bumps on the contact, so there's more of a sliding action when the switch is depressed. This leads to a more consistent feel and sound. I personally think these are the best, just because it kind of feels like you're typing on hydraulics when you use them, and the sound they make when the rest of the keyboard is well constructed is one of the most premium and satisfying options of all keyboards. Alright, so now you have some idea of the mechanical functions and what's actually going on in a keyboard, at least as far as most people really care, unless they want to get really into the hobby. So, let's keep all that in mind when we talk about this guy. The 8Bitdo Retro Mechanical Keyboard. I know, super creative name. Let's start off with the overall design. The most obvious appeal of this keyboard. It is clearly attempting to appeal to a retro gaming enthusiast audience who has some nostalgia for the NES era of home consoles and games. This keyboard uses much the same design language as 8BitDo's other foray into the NES, their arcade stick. Now, I made a video about this guy a bit ago. If you're interested in my thoughts on that, go check out that video here. But back to the keyboard. As I said, it uses a lot of the same design language that 8BitDo developed for the arcade stick. It just adds a bit where necessary. And I do say developed because I don't really think the process was as simple as taking a picture of the NES and copying the colors and fonts. In fact, 8BitDo have opted, with this keyboard and the arcade stick, for a much more nostalgic approach, instead of a more true-to-life one. You see, while many of us think of the NES as being this retro beige color, it actually wasn't. It was gray, a very similar gray to this Super Famicom that I picked up not too long ago. Let me know if you guys want me to make a video about the design on this. I think it's particularly interesting. But back to the keyboard. The beige color just comes from the dyes in the plastic degrading with exposure to UV light. So clearly, if they were going for an actual literal representation, they should have gone with gray. But they decided to go with the color people think of when talking about retro hardware, instead of the actual true color. And I think this was a very smart and effective choice to make, especially when you're selling a product mainly off of nostalgic appeal. Now, aside from the obvious callbacks to the NES, like the red font, this beautiful black bar, and the A and B macro buttons right here, there are also much more subtle and effective choices being made here. Take this power light, for example. On the NES, the power light was made flush with the surface, and it was quite small in comparison to the actual unit. But 8BitDo have opted for a much more interesting approach here. Again, playing off the idea of retro hardware rather than what it actually was. This dull, off-axis, domed-style indicator light calls back to retro hardware from things like Star Trek, with their numerous indicator lights, switches, and knobs. This is not a style of light that was ever used by Nintendo, especially not on the NES. But it gives the impression of old, outdated, less effective hardware from a simpler time. And that follows in the mode and volume knobs as well. This isn't a style of knob that was ever used by Nintendo. In fact, I'm not really sure if Nintendo ever included a knob in any of their hardware at all. But it implies an older way of doing things, a more analog input than we're used to. And some of the more basic elements of the keyboard are just good examples of good design made by people who know what they're doing. The bottom plate, for example. It's this dark gray, which is mirrored throughout the design as a whole. And while it certainly calls back to the NES with its black bottom half, this choice wasn't just made because the NES did it. It was made because it gives this keyboard grounding. It gives it a visual weight at the bottom of the keyboard. If they had simply been following Nintendo's lead, they would have made it come up to the halfway point and not stop at about the 1/3 mark. To me, things like this show the competence of the designers over at 8BitDo, and really help the keyboard to stick out when it comes to other retro designs, because they aren't simply taking an old product and adding Bluetooth or macros. They're picking up where the designers left off back in the day, and adapting the design language to fit their audience today. Alright, so we've covered the nebulous design of the keyboard, and while I could go on for days about all the little design choices that I really like about this keyboard, I'll go ahead and move on to the more function-focused aspects, and some of the things I don't really love about this keyboard. The model I decided to go with is the N edition. Subtle. This includes basically everything that the Fami edition does, just in a different style. That one drawing inspiration from the Famicom. But the aspects we care about include things like switch and X input modes, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and wired functionality, KL box clicky switches, a top mount board, die sub keycaps, and in my opinion the most important aspect, a hot swap PCB. While they don't give you the option to configure your keyboard from the factory, like many other keyboard sites tend to do, I think the base offerings that you get by default are more than good enough to build off of. First impressions are quite positive. The body is sturdy. It's overall a pretty solid weight, and there really isn't too much creaking when flexed. This can be an issue with plastic housings like this, though it really isn't a big deal if it does happen because, I mean, come on, how often are you going to be flexing your keyboard like this? The sound is a bit hollow, and there's more reverb than I would love out of the box, though that is kind of unavoidable at this price with a large housing like this and made out of ABS. Fortunately, that is totally fixable, as one of the major draws to mechanical keyboards is their modability. Generally speaking, you're able to take apart and mod your keyboard to be exactly how you want it, provided it's designed in a way to encourage this. And that brings me to my major complaint about this keyboard, opening it up. For those of you who watched my arcade stick video, you'll remember that one of my favorite things about it was that they really designed around it being opened up and played with. That, unfortunately, is not the case with this. The thing about the arcade stick that I loved so much was that they didn't hide the screws behind the feet of the unit, and it didn't use clips, both of which aren't true here. I was very disappointed to see 8Bitdo move backwards like this. I personally don't think it would have been too much to ask to simply add 1 or 2 more screws to the bill of materials to keep the housing secure without requiring clips. Some of you may be wondering why I care so much about this. And sure, it's a relatively dumb thing to get super worked up about. But the reason I hate them so much is because they force you to mar the parting line of your product if you want to open it. And sure, you could just say, be careful, go slower. But frankly, I don't think there's any speed at which you can go that doesn't risk a clip snapping or leaving little dents all over the overall phenomenal seam they have on display here. A bit of a side tangent, but one of the most understated but impressive things you can do in manufacturing is to have extremely tight and clean seams. Oftentimes this is used as a bit of a mark of quality for a product, and forcing you to ruin it if you want to open up the thing that you own sucks. As far as hiding screws under feet, I just think that we're past the need to hide fixtures in products. As impressive as it might be to see something that is totally sealed and you can't quite figure out how, it's really not worth the repair hassle it causes down the line. Now, to be fair, if you don't want to mod your keyboard at all, the switches are hot swap, so the part that's most likely to need repair can easily be swapped a la carte. But the principle is still the same. It clearly communicates that 8Bitdo don't really want you opening this up and changing it around, which is a real bummer coming from the arcade stick, which seemingly had that as a huge focus of its design. Okay, I'm done complaining. Back to some of the things I really adore. The macro pad? Freaking phenomenal. The choice to add the ability to use up to 8 extra buttons off-board is amazing. I personally haven't found a use for the macro pad, but the beauty is, if I do, it's right there, and I can either buy more to expand functionality, or make my own because it's really just as simple as hooking up the 2 leads of any switch to a 3.5mm jack, and then programming what it does in the software. That is honestly amazing, and I think that way more keyboards should have something like this, and embrace this kind of expandability. And on the topic of the macro pad, just look at this thing. It's freaking awesome. It screams retro Nintendo gaming hardware, and come on, who doesn't want to have 2 giant red buttons sitting at their desk just begging to be pressed? And not only that, it's just a normal mechanical switch, so you can change the feel to be anything you want. And given the price that this keyboard comes in at, around $100, this is a huge value add, especially if you have a use for macros. Okay, so I clearly love this keyboard. I think the design prowess on display here, and frankly from all of 8Bitdo's hardware offerings, is pretty unique in the third-party accessory space. And when you add to that the value they offer, with most of their hardware being fairly cheap for what you get, at the time of writing anyway, it's pretty hard to go wrong with anything from 8Bitdo. Now obviously the usual disclaimers apply. They're a company and they don't care about you, and you shouldn't think that they won't screw you if they think it'll make them money. But for me personally, I've never seen a company make such consistently consumer-friendly choices as 8Bitdo. And while they aren't without fault, and they are not to be unquestioningly trusted, I haven't seen much of a reason not to trust them with your purchase. This keyboard is a real microcosm of 8Bitdo as a company. It's really great value, they clearly care about the design and really understand what makes a good design good, as well as how to appeal to their audience. Though they aren't incapable of making bad choices, like those damn feet and clips, they have generally shown, time and time again, that they seemingly find it more profitable to do what's good for their consumer instead of just what's good for their bottom line. And I can really respect that. But what do you think? Are you interested in this keyboard? Do you think you could actually make use of the macro functions? Either way, I thank you so much for watching. I know you didn't have to. Have a great day, and happy gaming and designing.